Okay, well, I will take that as an opportunity to get started. So welcome everyone to our panel on migrant justice amidst global crises. We have a lot prepared for today and with our three expert speakers. And so I'm going to try to keep this intro short. So this panel is going to be about 2 hours long and we'll have a short 5-minute break at the 1 hour mark right around 7 p.m. The last half hour of this event is going to be reserved for audience questions. So my name is Layla and I represent the VUSAC Sustainability Commission, and I'm very happy to co-organize this panel with our friends over at UTEA. So the VUSAC Sustainability Commission strives to provide educational resources and programming and advocate on behalf of students' interests and needs as they relate to sustainability and its many intersections at VIC. And the University of Toronto Environmental Action, UTEA, is a UTSG environmental justice group focused on research, outreach, and advocacy. So our chat moderators will put some contact info in the chat right now, and we'll be including them in our list of webinar resources following the event. For audience members, please keep your microphones muted for the duration of the event to minimize any background noise, and please use the chat to ask any of the questions that you have for our speakers, and we'll kind of reserve those and put them into a document for the end of the webinar. Our chat moderators, Sophia and Andy, wave. We'll note them down and we'll save these questions for the last half hour of the webinar. Our chat moderators will also be posting links and resources into the chat throughout the event. To view only the speakers on your screen as they speak, you can toggle the speaker view at the top right corner of your screen. If anyone has any technical difficulties during the event, please feel free to message Sophia or Andy privately and they'll do their best to assist you. A couple notes on accessibility. We absolutely do not tolerate any hateful or discriminatory behavior at this event. If any of this should happen, our chat moderators will deal with the issue accordingly. We will also be recording this webinar and uploading it online. And we'll be posting a compilation of the resources mentioned during the webinar in the Facebook event page after the fact. So that's about it for housekeeping. Moving on. So we'd like to begin this event with a land acknowledgement. We're grateful that with video conferencing, we're able to bring this panel to a wider audience of people from many places. Our group is based in the city called Toronto, and many viewers have ties to this place, so I'm going to talk about it for this land acknowledgement. So this place we call Toronto has been the site of human activity for 15,000 years. The name Toronto has origins in a word in the Wendat language that refers to a type of dam used for fishing. For millennia, this land was an important gathering place for Indigenous peoples to engage in seasonal fishing activities, commerce, cultural exchange, and for this reason, the word that named our city has taken on other meanings in diverse Indigenous languages, meanings such as the gathering place. So even in the naming of our city, we can see that this place was and still is an important gathering place for Indigenous peoples. This land has been inhabited by the Huron-Wendat, the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations. In the Dish with One Spoon, the dish is the land around the Great Lakes and with all of its resources, and each of us has just one spoon with which to eat. By using the spoon to take only what we need, we leave land and resources for others to enjoy as we all work together to secure the livelihoods of future generations. As an uninvited guest and immigrant settler on this land, I commit and implore those of you watching to listening, caring, and advocating as the best allies we can be for Indigenous autonomy and land sovereignty. Canada's long history of cultural genocide has resulted in profound Indigenous suffering, and we must act as an angry agent for change and accountability for the greater institutions that continue to perpetuate harm upon people and land. We cannot move forward until Indigenous narratives and perspectives are prioritized. If you'd like to learn more about the Indigenous history of Toronto, an excellent overview was published in the first issue of U of T's First Nations House magazine. The link will be posted in the chat shortly. So now a brief introduction into each of our panelists. First off, we have Elaine Lam, who is the founder and executive director of Butterfly, an Asian and migrant sex workers support network, and the Migrant Sex Workers Project. She's been involved in both the gender and sex works movements, as well as migrant and labor activism for almost 20 years. She is a PhD candidate in social work at McMaster University. Our second panelist, Saad El-Hakmi, is currently pursuing his PhD in policy studies at Ryerson University. His research interests are advocacy for democracy and social inclusion of racialized communities, civic and democratic engagement, citizenship and sense of belonging, labor market experiences of immigrants, immigration laws and policy, and migrants' identity. Last but not least, we have Simran Duna, who is an organizer with the Migrant Students United, a campaign to build power among international students across Canada at the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. Simran is also a graduate of the Master of Public Health program in epidemiology at the University of Toronto. So we'll now move into audience questions. Or sorry, not audience questions, panelist questions. So to start with, we have a couple general questions that I'm going to open to all speakers. So our first question is, what are some ways migrants experience global issues such as economic and climate crises differently? And so for this question, I'll start with Elaine, if you would like to speak on that.
Hi, how are you? So thank you so much for introducing me, and then thank you for organizing this amazing panel. So I'm from Butterfly, which is an Asian and migrant sex worker support network. So this is based in Toronto, but we also support the migrant sex worker in different cities in Canada. And so because I would like to give a little bit background before I answer your question. So I think for migrant sex worker particularly, they are facing a lot of problem. Particularly there is a lot of reason why people migrate. Even now COVID is affects the way of people migrate, but particularly what we see why people migrate is because of like a lot of climate issue, make a lot of land being destroyed. So, and also the people need to find different way to survive. So that is the way of migrant, and also the economic inequality. So, and social equality is also the reason for people migrant, and political also is other important issue. But at the same time, we can see in our history, people always migrate, right? But the migrant control is stronger and stronger, and particularly against like the people from global south, particularly racialized and also women, like gender non-conforming people, so and LGBT community, so that the migrant control make the people more difficult to migrate, and also make the people when they migrate, many of their resources and also the rights is being taken away. So that to make the people, when they come to the country, they are more precarious, so that they are more easy to be taken advantage by other people. And so many people think that sex work is bad, is exploitation, but what we see in the experience of migrant sex worker, actually sex work is a powerful resilience and resistance of many kind of oppression, like racism, classism, and many workers also said that actually from the experience of migration, they have experienced a lot of challenge, and sex work is one of the way can give them power, give them resources that they can overcome those challenges, including money, including they can like access like legal support through getting money, and so that when we see global, we also need to recognize that for migrant sex worker, people think they must be vulnerable, but there is also a lot of white sex worker from US or Canada moves work in Thailand, right? They may not have so much problem as the racialized worker work in Canada or other white country, because they may not face the same racism because of the white supremacy. They may the people more privileged, that they may not lost the immigration status. So, and I will talk about how the law affected the migrant sex worker, but I think yeah, so that is and I think sex work is a very powerful resistance. So when we think about migrant facing a lot of challenge, and we should not forget what kind of resistance and resilience they use in their experience. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that response. I'll pass it on to Simran now.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good way of sort of covering some of the forces that make a lot of migrant workers vulnerable across the world, not just in Canada. It's important to remember, like, migration is natural. It always has been since the history of time, since the history of humans, right? But it's borders and the reasons, the political reasons that coerce and compel people to leave behind their communities and their lands that are not natural. Those are created, those are structured intentionally by the ruling class, by people who stand to benefit from that migration in a particular way. And so as someone who's currently working with the Migrant Students United campaign, with Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, for migrant students, there's so many reasons why they come here, right? And a lot of that is tied to Western hegemony and imperialism, this idea that your labor and your life is really only valuable if you come to a Western country and you learn English and you perform in the labor market in a specific way, and as well as economic disempowerment in their home countries as a result of national and transnational policies. Those are some of the reasons why people are compelled to study and work in Canada. And of course, when they come here, especially from, countries like India and China and Latin America, countries in Latin America, people come here and they find that that is not the case, right? So I recently found out, I'm Punjabi, by the way, I'm from India, and I found out that 70% of Punjabi international students who come here actually come from farming families. And when you think about actually the history of farming in Punjab, which is a livelihood that has been present for so many families for generations. It was in the 70s and 80s when America and Western forces started a green revolution where, transnational corporations started bringing a lot of different types of technologies and tried to control local forms of livelihood and farming that resulted in now a crisis of debt among farming families. And there's an epidemic of farmers killing themselves because they simply can't reproduce their livelihood through farming. And a lot of those families, those young people then sell their land, take on loans in order to come here and provide for their families back home. And that the byproduct of farmer suicides back home actually leads students here who then struggle here also to actually struggle with mental health, and like the suicide rates here among international students is also really high. So all of that is tied to in that particular case, like Western policies that have impacted people back home, as well as the climate crisis that exacerbates their livelihoods back home. And in the case of care workers and migrant workers, it's very much the same forces, right? Canada creates conditions of destabilization through economic policies, trade, war, extractivism, and that forces people to lose their community self-determination, their socioeconomic autonomy. And when you combine that with the industry of exploitative recruiters back home in India or in the Philippines, or like really in any country that exports migrant workers, of course, people are told a lot of myths about the success they would find here. And those people take advantage of migrant workers in the form of offering services to fill out bureaucratic applications and taking out a huge chunk of their savings. And that's obviously, if people are familiar with the care workers program, the Philippines is one of the #1 countries that exports, racialized gendered labor, nurses and care workers who have specialized skills, and they migrate to Dubai, Saudi Arabia, America, Canada, and that is absolutely tied to a legacy of colonization of the Philippines over its history. And it's now tied to also the typhoons and the different climate crises that those communities face. So all of this is to say that the current system of migrant labor that exists in Canada is a result of economic crises that have been created from colonial forces over time, and what exists now is really a form of indentured servitude.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I'll pass it on to Saad to respond to that question now.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Leila and all the organizers for this wonderful event. And to answer the question, it is worth noting that we might have different categories of migrants, and therefore their experiences will vary from a context to the other. So some of them are fleeing war or persecution from their countries of origin. Others are displaced due to natural or environmental catastrophes, while others are in the process of immigration to a host country. So definitely the most vulnerable populations will struggle more with their current conditions. And then if we add to this the pandemic situation, they are kind of struggling with the limited mobility, and their conditions are not good. So definitely they will face a bitter conditions, and they will not be as comfortable as someone that is, for example, just making an application of immigration to a country that is either in the Western or the global North. So some of these people will also face, I would like to say, delays in their application times due to these conditions now, and they might be kind of frustrated to wait. And I would say that the impact of all of these global crises, we have the refugees crisis, we have the global climate change, and all of this can have like a mental impact on migrants in general. And whether they are in a transition or they arrive to their final destination, this will probably leave like a kind of mental impact. So that's what I wanted to contribute. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to all the panelists for their responses to that question. Moving on to our next question, which is quite closely tied to this one. Why have recent immigrants to Canada continued to face social, economic, and political exclusion? And I will pass it on to Simran for this question first.
Thanks. So there are a lot of reasons why migrants face exclusion along multiple levels, and it's definitely tied to Canada's multi-tiered immigration system. Not every migrant who comes here is the same, has the same class background, comes for the same reason. And that segmentation and sort of stratification of migrants is deliberate and is a function of Canada's history of immigration. I'm so sorry if you're hearing those notifications. But that's absolutely tied to, all of the previous history of immigration in Canada, from the Chinese head tax to all of the, very particular reasons why throughout history, Canada has wanted certain people from certain countries to come to build the railway, to care for people. And so decision makers make migrant workers excluded and temporary and precarious through these various streams. And some immigrants through, economic immigrant streams are framed as more deserving of certain rights and others are not, when functionally everyone is contributing to the economy, but also has the very same basic needs of living and working in dignity. But we know that even recent immigrants that align most closely with the mainstream public imaginary of a multicultural, immigrant-friendly Canada are also they come here and experience de-skilling and precarity, and are streamlined into low-wage precarious sectors. So for a lot of us, we probably know other people in our family or friends who come here hoping to work in a certain sector, but over time they're not able to actually work in the field that they were trained for. And the reason for that type of exclusion is really, really simple, right? It's the very shitty jobs that Canada doesn't want middle-class white Canadians to take on, to settlers to take on. Those jobs are reserved for people who migrate here under those different streams, whether it's the temporary foreign worker stream, or whether you're an international student, or whether you're here under a sponsorship program, and that is intentional, and that system can change if we push back, and it has changed when you push back, right? So I think about the example of, for care workers, very, very early on, when people were brought here to do domestic work, those were women, particularly low-income, poor women from parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, and in England. And when they came here to do the same work that racialized women are doing now, they were actually offered permanent residency on arrival. And then when Canada decided, we want Jamaican women, we want Black women and Filipino women to be doing this work, that option of status on arrival was actually taken away. Why? Because as soon as these women in these programs were done that temporary period of care work, that type of work was so low wage and so abusive and exploitative that, of course, when they had PR, they had no incentive to do that type of care work anymore, right? So these immigration rules are actually ways in which Canada keeps people temporary and keeps people doing the types of jobs that are not made quality, decent work for everyone else.
And I will pass it on to Saad to answer this question.
Yes, thank you, Simran, and thank you, Leila. So looking back at the history of immigration in Canada since 1967, and with the introduction of the point system, in which Canada shifted their immigration policies from selecting immigrants based on their ethnicities and their countries of origin to a selection based on some points, and some points that are tied to their previous education, to their previous work experience, and some aspects of their life at their countries of origin, and their willingness to contribute to the Canadian economy. And if I have to compare the recent immigrants with the previous cohorts, I would say that they are no different from the previous cohorts, in a sense that they still face the same exclusions in the economic, political, and also social spheres. If we talk about these exclusions, they are the results of a non-efficient integration process that is happening in Canada. Canada is labeling this integration process as a two-way process in which we are asking immigrants to make efforts in order to fit within the Canadian society, but at the same time, they are asking authorities and governments, institutions, to also be ready and open to integrate immigrants in the labor market, in the economy, in the society, and so on. But what is happening is this two-way process is simply turning into an assimilation, and we are putting the weight on immigrants simply to find themselves in the Canadian society with the limited resources. So we are giving them settlement agencies as the first point of contact. So when they arrive, they go there and they mainly seek some informations about some jobs, about housing, about healthcare. So there are many basic information that they get in, and because they are facing economic and also I would say social exclusion, then they will just be stuck in this loop of settlement, which is the first stage of their integration process. So therefore, what happens to them, they will never be able to get out of this because they will face many barriers. They will have the language barrier, of course, depending on the categories, but many categories will face the language barrier, will face also the Canadian experience, will face the non-recognition of their skills and their credentials back home, and therefore they will not be able to fully integrate into the civic and economic aspects of the society. So that's my analysis on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and finally, I will pass it on to Elaine.
Yeah, I think just like Samar and said, so it's actually is like whole policy system create those exclusion, right? So, and I think as Samar said, the different tier system of the immigration status really is create the exclusion that they can maintain the system, that they can use migrant and also take advantage of the migrant and without giving them any like rights, right? So, and I think they are not only create a system that people come with different tier, but they also create a system that keep taking away the people immigration's status to make them more. So that's why we can see so many policy actually have the time limit, they have so many criteria. And for migrant sex worker, we see so many people actually is being kicked out from that they're here already, they have been very vulnerable. And then so many people, so for example, refugee claimant, there is a lot of restriction and they have like more and more harder policy, make a lot of people is not able to success the like refugee claim, and then they become non-status, so that they are being even kicked out from the system. And I think when we talk about like migrant, what social, economic, political issue, and then we can also see the intersectionality of race, gender, immigration status, how to cause the exclusion. So that it's like you see more close to whites, they have more entitled, more power, more people speak English, that they may have like more power resources. But if the people is more farther from that white, that they are being more excluded. And I think sometimes people said that, oh, people have language barrier, that's why they, of course, they face a lot of challenge. But I think in our society, language barrier can be overcome by so many technology tools, right? But they are not offering those tools and support that to make that barrier maintain, that to maintain that they are excluded. And I can use like COVID as the example, right? So that like people with those vaccine number, they are not able to get like any income support from the government, even they have been worked for in Canada so long and contributed to the society so long, they're being excluded. We can see the health system. So many state, they need the like most of the place, they need the people to have social insurance, health insurance, and then the immigration status also exclude the people. And for many of our members also have the language barrier, even they are, some of them may entitle of somehow of health support and service, because of the language barrier, there is no interpretation in the health system, healthcare system, they're being excluded, right? And also the legal parts, and I would describe a little bit more, but we can see how criminalization of immigration like come together, make the people being like excluded. So, and I think there is so many layers that the policymaker and Canadian society is create a system explicitly to exclude the people. And sometimes it's very dangerous because they also create a little bit resources to make the people feel that, oh, Canada society is great, they respect the human rights, they take care of everyone. So but in reality, most people is not able to access those resources. And I think the other big piece, employment is the big piece. So as we just described, the immigration status already makes some people may not able to work legally. Even they work legally, they may not able have the same rights as other people. They cannot get the labor protection. And also the discrimination, racism also make a lot of people feel that, right, that Canadian experience is important, and then they do not have Canadian experience, and they are not able to get the same money in the job, or they even don't have the employment opportunity. So I think U of T recently have the research to see how the name that represent the ethnic background already affects the opportunity to get hired, get employed. We don't need to mention about the opportunity of promotion or everything. And so for Butterfly, we work with a lot of Asian worker, and many of them is really not able to find like a job or decent job, right? So that some people may able to find a job, but as Samar said, that is mostly is like maybe need to under minimum wage, long working time hour, the middle class white people don't want to work, and then they are being kept away from those jobs. Then they are being keep used and exploited in those work. But so, for example, some Asian migrant worker, when they want to work in massage parlor, they have better income, they have better resources, but then they are being targeted, right? That they are being always pushed back, that they are not able to work in the industry. They find they may have better income, better working hour, and then being pushed in like more other bad working environment. So and the political, social, economic exclusion is so many layers. So for example, last year we went to City Hall when the city of Toronto tried to shut down like 400 massage parlor, like 2,000 Asian women, we lost the job. So when we went to City Hall, there is no interpretation service, so that to keep them away before, only the email or like the letter with English notice, that most people do not able to participate in those political consultation. So, but when even 300 workers work there, the voice is not being listened. But there is one white lady say, like, many massage parlor has a lot of traffic victims, they need to shut down. Then the city and city council listen to them, right? So that's how we see that the power also play out in the system to make the voices being excluded. And I think political exclusion is so powerful and important. So for example, now they require the people to do English tests, including to get the citizenship, right? So by that, they exclude a lot of Asian, a lot of racialized people, a lot of people English and French is not their first language, to get their political power. Then by that, they can continue to maintain different social legal system to exclude them. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you to all the panelists for your responses to that question. I'm now going to move into some questions that are specific to Simran and your work. So the first question we have is, based on some of your work, how do you think issues facing international students are related to the issue of migrant rights?
Thanks, Layla. Yeah, so international students have only in more recent years, especially because of you know, how many more people are coming through that stream, have only recently been treated and seen as a section of migrant workers whose labor is exploited, and exploited under the guise of like global education, right? So some of the issues that they're facing are actually outlined in our petition. The biggest one that maybe all of you might be familiar with, maybe you're already an international student, and if you are, feel free to share it in the comments, or you probably know others who are, especially at U of T. But you know, tuition fees. Tuition fees are 3 to 4 times higher than domestic students for the same education. And in fact, those tuition fees have been increasing at many universities and colleges under the pandemic, even though, of course, people are taking classes online under greater stress and without access to the same facilities and supports. And of course, there's a proliferation of hundreds of private colleges and institutions that offer these students a sham education, while recruiters, as I said, back home, make money off of international students, as well as the immigration system here also economically benefits a lot from that form of exploitation. So tuition fees is one of the issues that, you know, shows how little parity there is in terms of education for international students. But even while they're working here, you know, if you have a tuition fee that's like 20, 30,000 per year, you have to be able to work to pay that off, because even the loans or the land or the property you've sold back home is often not enough. And it's absolutely a myth that international students who come here are somehow like really rich. So people, international students, migrant students, have to be working while they're in school. But at the same time, there's a maximum of 20 hours that you can work off campus. And any work that they do while on a study permit like for example, during a co-op or any part-time work that international students do while studying doesn't even count towards their applications to PR. And one example of that in terms of some of the violation of people's rights that people have experienced is Jobandeep Singh. He was an international student from Punjab who about a year ago was pulled over on the highway, I think just outside the GTA or in the GTA. And the cops suddenly decided to just look through his record and found out that he was working over the 20 hours. They didn't need to actually look into him at all, but they did. And he faced deportation. And so, you know, we organized tens of thousands of petition signatures to stop his deportation because there were only like 3 months left until he could graduate and get his degree. And unfortunately, he ended up being deported, but it's an example of which that shows that how migrant students are penalized and criminalized in the system as well. The third thing is renewable work permits is a big issue right now that I'll talk about later as well. But pretty much after international students finish their study permit and they graduate, they are eligible for a postgraduate work permit that is time restricted. And during that time, they can only work in high wage specific industries that count towards their PR application. But under the pandemic, the average person can't even find a job, let alone international students who are discriminated against in the labor market. And so their work permits have run out and they're also facing deportation and facing undocumented status. As Eileen pointed out, you know, international students as well as so many migrant workers don't have access to the same universal services. So that includes access to healthcare. There are absolutely migrant students who don't have a valid OHIP, who don't have access to the same healthcare, and are left out of, you know, CURB or CRB because they don't have a valid SIN number. There are also migrant students who are either here with their family and risk being separated or are separated from their families back home. And under the pandemic, you know, a lot of people are stressed out with the fact that family members back home are either ill or have died, but they can't actually go back and see their family because that would mean they're starting from, you know, point zero and can't come back and continue, you know, the trajectory they were on in order to get PR. And finally, status for all, right? So status, in other words, permanent residency, is this carrot that Canada dangles in front of migrant workers and says, you have to work and grind yourself to the bone. And even during that work, you're not going to have the same rights to maybe have access to this thing that will actually give you dignity in terms of your workplace and your everyday life. So one of the things that would absolutely change everyone's material conditions is full and permanent immigration status for all migrants and undocumented people, which we can absolutely talk about later.
Yeah, thank you so much for that very thorough response. So our next question for you, I think you touched on this a little bit, but if you'd like to elaborate, what are some of the issues that migrant students, as well as other workers, such as care workers, migrant farm workers, what are some of the issues that they face during the pandemic specifically?
For sure. So migrant workers, especially migrant students, are, I mean, on the one hand, there are people who can't find a job and they've been laid off. But on the other hand, the jobs that people have been able to find are in essential industries during the pandemic. You know, it's migrant workers, it's international students who are driving trucks, who are working in Amazon warehouses, grocery stores, and retail and fast food. And those are also the places that are seeing disproportionate COVID risk and outbreaks. And at the same time, it's migrant workers who've been completely left out of social and economic supports during the pandemic and still don't have any real pathway to PR and face deportation, as is the case with tens of thousands of migrant students right now whose work permits are expiring. But on top of that, like the pandemic unveils a lot of the issues that migrant workers have been facing even beforehand, right? So like, you know, we met a worker at our last action on October 25th, someone who is here with his family, is trying to study, and, you know, has a lot of debt from having to pay such high tuition fees, and at the same time is facing precarious housing, because for a migrant worker to, you know, rent here, you have to show that you can pay 6 months of rent and you have to pay that up front. So all of these issues in terms of education, immigration status, housing are much more compounded for migrant workers. And specifically for care workers, we know that care workers are facing unsafe workplaces. They're isolated because a lot of them do still have to live with their employers. And there's actually a really amazing report that came out about 2 weeks ago. And there's a second one as well that's by care workers, and about 200 workers, migrant care workers, spoke out about the abuse and exploitative conditions they faced. Some of them aren't even allowed to leave their workplace because of COVID restrictions, which is absolutely a violation of their human rights. And same with farm workers experiencing unsafe and horrible working conditions. Some of you may have heard about some farm workers who have actually died due to COVID while working in Niagara region or other parts of Ontario. And it's not even certain that their bodies will be sent back home to their families. But in a recent win that some of you may have heard, there was one farm worker, Gabriel, who actually won in a legal case against a multi-million dollar farm employer because he was fired for speaking out when his co-worker, his bunkmate, was died from COVID. But he won in the courts, and that's an example of how migrant workers are resisting every single day and are winning when they come together and against all odds are speaking out in the face of fear and threats. So those are some of the issues that migrant students and migrant workers are facing and are still speaking out very courageously.
Yeah, thank you so much for your responses to those questions, Simran. I'm now going to move on to some questions specifically for Saad. So to begin, could you speak a little bit on the intersection between race and belonging in relation to migration?
Thank you, Leila. So in an attempt to make a connection between these three concepts, I would like to say a little bit about race. And the concept of race has moved away from pointing at physical differences to a socially constructed perspective, which is influenced by economy, culture, religion, and politics. For instance, in Western countries, dominant and powerful groups reinforce ideologies to legitimize the current social order, economic, and political situations. A country like Canada, for example, are not only socially constructing migrants based on their skin color, but also see them as outsiders, non-fluent English speakers, inferior to the mainstream norms and standards, and willing to work in low-paid jobs. On the other hand, we have newcomers that assess their sense of belonging to their country of settlement by expressing whether they feel welcomed, whether they feel secure, or whether they feel included in the host society. But when they face social, economic, and political exclusion, they will naturally show a weak sense of belonging to the country of settlement. So that's my attempt to connect these points together and relate it to the experiences of migrants.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So our next question for you is, how do participatory models of advocacy allow migrants to more effectively fight for their rights?
So basically, when we talk about participatory advocacy, I would like to mention, based on my work and research in the field, there are multiple routes of participatory advocacy that can be useful for migrants to fight for their rights. I will cite few of them and few ways to do so. So migrants, as also residents and citizens, they can join social movements, which are informal memberships in which the binding individuals share common beliefs or values about a policy issue, usually at the societal level. And this kind of groups is for a short term, and when there is like an issue around the policy that will vanish in a certain amount of time, people can gather together and then be part of these like networks and discuss the policy issues. Also, there is another one called Advocacy Coalition, which is a similar way of bringing people together, bringing like migrants and also citizens together to discuss like an important issue about existing policies. I can give an example. For example, we have like foreign doctors, international medical trained doctors that come to Canada, and they are not able to practice their profession because this profession is regulated by some governmental bodies. So they have to go through a licensing process in order to practice their professions in Canada. Therefore, they have no other way than following this process. They will not be able to like start their work, and they have to go through like a very lengthy process. So what happens is there are many people that are in the same situation, and they can come up together and they can form a coalition, like many international medical doctors that were trained outside, and some of them are like surgeons that have been practicing for 20 years or so. And it is a shame to see that they cannot exerce their profession here in Canada. So therefore, they might join like groups, and these groups are informal, and they might be able to discuss this issue and then face another coalition that is representing the current norms and current standards. And then they will be able to kind of enter into like a policy process and interact with governmental agencies. Now, telling this or citing those channels and routes in which migrants can participate is not the problem. The problem is access to information or even knowledge about such movements that are existing in the society. Most of immigrants, when they come to Canada, they are not aware. They are, as I said before, they are stuck in the settlement process, and they are trying to survive all this stage of settlement, that they have no access to information. And even settlement agencies, they don't have access to such information. They are not socially integrated in order to be part of this process. Sorry, I think I have a problem with my computer. My computer is freezing.
I can still hear you okay.
Oh, you can still hear me. So my screen is, I have like a blank screen, but if you can still hear me, that's great. So what I was saying is access to information is the most important problem that is existing now for migrants. And if migrants have a way to have access to that information in a better way, then like the outreach of settlement agencies or even people that know about those information can be helpful for migrants. So that's the answer to my question.
Yeah, thank you. Are you okay to go ahead with the next question, or do you need to like leave the call and come back because of your connectivity?
I can try to leave the call and come back quickly.
Okay, yeah, in the meantime, why don't you do that? And then in the meantime, we can move on to the next questions.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, thanks. So now, moving on to some questions that we have for Elaine. Can you quickly introduce us to the sex workers movement and your work at Butterfly?
Yeah, so Butterfly is as I said, is an Asian and migrant sex worker support network. So instead, as position Butterfly as a social service organization, this is grassroots organization is focused on like the community organizing, building the collective power to advocate for the rights of the community. So that's why many of our work is focusing on leadership building and also like building the collective knowledge and resistance, and also like changing the injustice, particularly the legal system. So for the sex worker movement, thank you for asking this question. So we can see like how sex work, even they exist in like history in so long time, but because of the religion and colonialism idea and moralistic value, so sex work is always being treat as something bad, right? So that like we can see in Canadian society, like sex work as being criminalized, and sex worker is being seen as evil, bad woman, or they are sick, they are wrong. So there is so many policy before it's regulating. So for example, racialized women, before they walk outside, they can be punished and they can be arrested. And also how the Indigenous Act is controlling the woman, so that like but because of the successful of the gender movement and the women movement in particularly like last 20-30 years, more and more people recognize the agency of the woman, and particularly on the area of sexuality, that like more people supporting the idea of my body, my choice, that how sex and sexuality should not be limited inside the marriage, and so that the people should have the way they can control the body and how they use it, right? And we also see how sex worker movement is successfully gained the social support since 1970. More people recognize sex work is work. More people recognize same as like the LGBTQ movement, particularly gay movement, that is the issue, the country, the state should not intervene. So however, in like 10, 20 years ago, so the anti-trafficking movement is hugely pushed back those sex worker movement by framing sex worker as the victim. But at the same time, they are still using the moralistic religion idea that like to control the woman body, but they are packaging in the candy paper, right? That people think that this is the good thing, we are protecting the woman, but then actually is make the people is still control the woman body. But it's very interesting, we can see because the white woman movement is successful, we seldom see like middle class or high class sex worker, white sex worker being seen as the victim, right? They are working in the beautiful hotel, Four Seasons, or like that. They are not being bothered by any law enforcement, right? But for the racialized, particularly migrant, they are successful to put the victim label, Indigenous women, and also the youth, they are being seen as vulnerable, incapable to make the decision about themselves. So because of the racism, because of like those discrimination, the anti-sex worker group is using those discrimination to reinforce the victim label, that to justify all the work. So I will talk about the legal work and campaign they do, but that is something very important. We need to know why now sex worker movement is being pushed back, but they're more successful to push back the racialized, to push back the migrant, and also the youth and indigenous, right? So that, but it's also very interesting how race play the role. So for the Asian, they are more successful to put it as victim, but they also use the discrimination against the Black people, so that the Black people is being seen as criminal, right? But they are also treated the same, still have a over policing, criminalization. So that's the thing. And so that's why what Butterfly do is we do the work in different level. So we do a lot of grassroots organizing, particularly we have 24 hours hotline. We have like outreach to build the network of the community, but also share the information, assess, say, many migrant racialized people is excluded from access information. By that, they can take away the rights, right? So that we translate different information and make the information be accessible. They can know more about what happened to the society, know more about the law, know more about the rights. And we also have a lot of training to build the capacity and collective power. And we also have a lot of advocacy work to have the collective action, to bring the social change. And we also do a lot of public education to make the people to know about the voices of the migrant sex worker and also know how the policy is harming them. So it's not sex work or migrant, they are vulnerable, it's how the system, how the legal system and social system make them be vulnerable. So, and we also hope that like more people can have chance to really listen to the voice of the migrant sex worker and sex worker, because most of the voice is being excluded by the mainstream media. So because they are being dominant by the people with power, right? So.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So our next question to you builds a little bit on what you've already talked about, but more specifically, how does the criminalization of sex work and immigration laws put migrant sex workers at even greater risk? And to build on that, what are some of the legal barriers facing the legitimization and well-being of sex workers? What kinds of assistance and outreach do migrant sex workers need right now?
Yeah, so that, like, as I said, sex workers has long history being criminalized. So being a sex worker or doing sex work activity is being criminalized. So, but the sex workers are successful to challenge some of the law that, and also the Supreme Court has the judgment say, you do not allow the sex worker work together, you do not allow the sex worker work on the street, actually is unconstitutional because it's violates the human rights of the sex worker. So, however, because of the conservative government, they're not only changing a lot of like a bad immigration law, but they also criminalize a sex worker by criminalizing the clients and continues criminalize the third party, so that anyone like related to work with sex worker or support sex worker or doing advertisement, all is make it criminalized. And so, and the anti-sex worker group also create the illusion that like sex worker themselves is not criminalized, but it is not true. By that, they gain the support because they promote the ideology like, now the law is protect the woman, we punish the pimp, bad pimp, and punish the client because the demand like create a market, the woman body being used. However, actually it's not true, because the law is still targeting the sex worker themselves, because they are not able to screen the client and sex worker themselves. When they work together and support each other, they are being arrested. So we have so many workers being arrested, detained, and deported. So because of that, so the criminal law is the big piece. So there is a lot of resources on the websites of Canadian sex work law reform, that they have a lot of information about how the criminal law affected the sex worker and make the sex worker more marginalized. So in addition to criminal law, the migrant sex worker also facing the immigration law. So in addition, like all the law, like other migrant, even some of the migrant sex worker, they are allowed to work, but in the work permit, they said that they are not allowed to work in sex industry or sex related industry. Even massage parlor, strip club, they are legitimate business. So by that, they claim it is protecting the woman, avoid them to be exploited. But what we see, actually, this law is being used against the worker. For example, international student, that she, if she are being found in work in sex industry, her work permit being cancelled, her study permit being cancelled, and they will be kicked away from Canada. So that also the immigration law is other layer, working together with the immigration law, and also if anyone violate the have the conviction of criminal offense, and they may also be losing their immigration status. That how they are working together. But in addition to criminal and immigration law, the municipal law is also the powerful tools. Many people do not realize how they harm the sex worker, particularly now that they have so many cities. They shut down the strip club, they shut down the massage parlor by claiming to protect the woman or make the law being more restrictive. So there is so many crazy law to make people vulnerable. So for example, in the body rub parlor now, in Toronto, for example, the women work in the parlor do not allow to take the money directly of client, right? So that they must have someone pay someone to get the money for them, right? So, and also there is a lot of power give to the law enforcement, like, so for example, over policing, so much investigation, so much ticketing against the worker. And so the bylaw also do not allow the worker to lock the door. So in February, there was a workers being murdered, and like over 60 workers were being robbed, raped, like last year, but they are not even allowed to lock the door to protect the safety because they think the investigation inspection is more important than life. So as I mentioned, now have so many cities, they are changing the bylaw to make the people almost not able to offer the massage service. And so, and then and during the inspection, there is so many human rights violations. So for example, in Toronto, before they come in, we'll ask the woman take off the clothes. If they have sexy underwear, they will give them the ticket to say that you are not wearing professional clothing. And in 2016, so that like over 25%, when City of Toronto have no money for housing, no money for social service, they spend like over 20% of the resources of the law enforcement. So the number of investigation of against the massage parlor is almost 20% of overall investigation, including like taxi, including restaurants, so that like you see. But because of that over policing, people get a lot of ticket, they get a lot of fine, and place being shut down. And recently we also received a lot of women said that because they have received 5 tickets, that the license being taken away. So that is the way they make the business being like shut down. And by working together, we see so many city and criminal police and immigration, CBSA, and also by law enforcement work together to raid the place, that because they can use all the law to target the worker, right? So that if you are have temporary resident status or you are non-status, they can have the CBSA to arrest you, to take you away. But even you are the permanent resident, they may see whether they can have criminal law to charge you. If they cannot punish you by this 2 ways, they use the bylaw to punish you. So in our report, how anti-trafficking investigation harm the sex worker, in addition, those last few years have so many resources go to anti-trafficking. So for example, Ontario, they cut the OHIP, they just cut the long-term care support, they cut the legal aid, but they spent $300 million this year. They just announced $300 million announced to give to the anti-trafficking work. So those money is go to the NGO they against sex worker, to end sex worker. They work with politicians, work with law enforcement, the civilians, and shut down the place. And also a lot of resources also go to the law enforcement, so that giving bigger power of law enforcement to harm the community. So that what's behind the rescue, because we see the news is the rescue, but actually is the civilian arrest, detain, and deportation of the worker. And how those law is so powerful, make the migrant sex worker being is excluded from all the system, right? That like they are not able to access all the system because of the fear of like any legal like consequence. That by isolate themselves, they protect themselves, but by isolate themselves, they also lost the way they can access like different resources and power. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for those responses, Elaine. So it is now 7:08, so we will take a 5-minute break at this time, and we'll start back again at around 7:13. So feel free to grab a drink, go use the bathroom.
Listen to the stories. We cried and we laughed. Lessons from our history, but not of how we go back. 'Cause we strive to move forward, a vision of what we can be. Full is our circle, complete as you and me, and we'll fill it with love, and we'll fill it with joy, and we'll fill it with pride. A vision of what we can be. My first Alaskans, my first Alaskans, my first Alaskans. I love you. I love you. My people, I come to you as natives hand in hand. Shift of a paradigm. What's the answer? Maybe in the land. 10,000 years we met as beautiful native tribes. We didn't start this fire, but we kept it in the dark times. And you're mine, my first Alaskans, my first Alaskans, my first Alaskans. I love you. I love you, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. I love you, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. I love you. Listen to the stories, we cried and we laughed, and the time is now.
All right, I will give our panelists a couple seconds to come back. Right, fantastic. All right, great. So Thank you, everyone, for your responses so far. And this is just a quick reminder to any of the attendees to put any questions you have for our panelists in the chat, or you can private message them to Sophia or Andy. We'll note those questions down and we'll reserve them for the last 30 minutes of the webinar. So we now have some specific questions regarding policy that we'd like to direct at each of the panelists. So to start, Simran, what are some migrant worker related policies that you would like to have seen during this pandemic, and what are the consequences of the lack thereof?
Thanks. I don't want to be too redundant because I think I did outline some policy changes that could be made through the petition that I think was sent earlier, but I'll just resend it. The main thing right now that is like incredibly urgent is that we need work permits for international students to be renewed. And we need all of their work to be counted, because right now, to get a bit technical, under their work permit, only NOC occupational categories O, A, and B count towards their PR application, but people are only finding low-wage jobs under NOC C and D. So like all work that people end up finding right now should be valued towards people's applications. And of course, status for all is what we're all constantly fighting and organizing for. And as a common saying that's been said throughout the whole pandemic is that the pandemic is a portal. The pandemic is a very long portal. It keeps going, but it's a portal. And so there's a really important opportunity here to act on the urgency and the crisis that people are facing right now. And these types of policy changes, like renewing work permits, counting all work for PR, and even status for all, or like ensuring universal services. These are all actions policy changes that simply require someone like the immigration minister to just flick their pen, and it's a bureaucratic fix. Otherwise, there are also a lot of other policy changes that would meaningfully improve migrants' lives, right? So a lot of the other overlapping crises that people are facing, whether it's in the workplace where there's outbreaks and then, their employers are keeping the outbreak secret because of occupational health policies, or whether it's the lack of paid sick days for everyone in the province, or whether it's, mass evictions that are taking place. We know that any type of issue along any social area disproportionately impacts migrants. They're among the most vulnerable. So in addition to changes to immigration rules like extensions to work permits, all of these other changes that other working class movements like Keep Your Rent or 15 in Fairness or Status for All, like these are all policies that would improve the lives of migrants. And the consequences are that if we miss this opportunity, then post-pandemic, what's going to happen? It's already happening, right? They're going to say that we've spent all this money to support people during the pandemic. Now we have to cut back and we have to make cuts to all these services. And then those cuts in the form of austerity will end up impacting, again, migrants the most. And what's going to happen, and what typically has happened in the past, is that politicians as well as the media will, like always, use migrants as scapegoats. So we cannot allow migrants to be left behind in current policy changes and social supports, and we can't allow like xenophobia and racism to also be entrenched. We should not have people think that there aren't enough resources or that there isn't enough money for everyone to have access to these basic rights. And instead, we should be pointing to the abundance of resources that we do have, but that are simply being hoarded by people who, corporations and the wealthy who are hoarding that money. So I think in terms of worker policies, I've emphasized in the petition, but also like broadly, I think there's a lot of work that has to be done in including migrant rights in every single struggle that we're facing in other areas. And I just also want to say that, there's 20 of us who are here. More than 20 of us, 25. If all of us signed this petition, which we're actually delivering next Tuesday to Minister Mendicino's office. And if all of us signed it and then got 1 to 2 other friends to very quickly sign it, that would be a super meaningful action that people could take to push for some of these very concrete and realistic policies that we're asking for to support migrant students specifically.
Yeah, thank you so much for elaborating on that. Our next question is for Elaine, and you've already talked quite a bit about this, so don't feel the need to be redundant. But can you tell us a little bit more about how the anti-trafficking policies and abolitionist movement has actually targeted, victimized, and undermined sex workers' rights? And kind of similar to Simran's question, what improvements or changes would you like to see?
Yeah, so I think the very clear actually anti-trafficking movement is mainly dominant by the white people, that how the white feminists, like they are the incarcerated feminists, and they work with law enforcement and government, and all of them are benefit from the anti-trafficking campaign, right? The politician can like have a big slogan, anti-trafficking, and everyone is supported, and no one question about that. They can gain the political power. And now even there is like so many campaign defund police, and people think police is so problematic, have so much racial profiling. But when come to the anti-trafficking issue, people think that the rate of like police is good, the police is rescuing women, and then they can keep using it to get the social support of like that to continues increase the power, right? And also continues targeting the racialized people. And so the NGO, of course, they get so much funding. So to continue the moralistic agenda, we can see it's not only like the incarcerated feminist group, they often work with the religion group. Those group had long history involving in harming the indigenous community by like running the residential school, and then they are targeting the gay people. Now they are continuous targeting the sex worker, but then they use anti-trafficking to cover up their moral agenda and continues to do the harm. And so that's why it's so important we need to uncover what actually happened behind those policies. And I need to name the organization, including Canadian Women Foundation. So in 2012-13, they have published so many problematic, harmful research that even like at later stage, they don't put it on the website anymore. They think it's harmful, but this policy is still continues being used. And this organization is mainly also led by the white woman, that they love the police more than the worker. And now there is an organization called Canadian Center to End Anti-Trafficking. They are again is led by the white feminists. They call feminists, I don't call them feminists because they're against the women, against the sex worker, that they get so much funding. They get like almost like $12 million to run a hotline, that they pretend themselves is protecting the victim, that to refer the resources, but we need to know who fund this hotline. Is our CMP. By this hotline, they can collect the information. So this NGO is collecting the information for law enforcement, right? But they continue doing a lot of harm. When we advocate in the city hall to protect the workers to keep the job, they are the white ladies say there is a lot of trafficking there, and how they know the information, they just heard from the police. They even do not connect like any entire worker, right? And so that's why they are so problematic and harmful. And we have more increasing of the worker being arrested, detained, and deported. And so the anti-trafficking law and policy and campaign make us even more difficult to push back, because many people think this is a good policy. They get so much social support, and not only the government sector and NGO, but they also work with the corporate, right? So that we see also how so many like corporate, they also involved in the campaign. And that's just like not only in Canada, but it's like the global campaign is huge. So that's why we need your support. So we have a lot of information. So for example, migrant per sex worker is not trafficking. So we have the report to tell you what actually happened behind the rescue. When you see the news that like the police is raided a massage parlor or the police has cracked down the organized crime ring. Who are the organized crime ring? It's few women work together, they support each other. Because of the language barrier, they may need someone to rent the place, and then that they can use this place. They may share some of the profit. But when we think like a sex worker, when they gain $100, the boss take $50, you think this is exploitation. But when we can see migrant worker, when they make the plant the potato, when they sell $2, how much the farmer gets is less than 2 cents, right? We don't see it's exploitation. So, and I think that is so important. We really hope you to help to understand this issue and also share this message. And we also have the petition to ask to stop the harm of anti-trafficking work. So not only law enforcement, but also like all the NGO. So, and so this is very, very important. And we also emphasize rights, not rescue. So people may face different challenge like other industry. People may also feel exploitation, or might like also feel violence. So, but we do not say criminalize family when there is so many women being abused by the husband, or so many domestic violence, that we don't criminalize marriage, right? But instead, how we can support the people experience the violence, or how we can create empower the people, they can resist those and prevent those situations. So criminalize the community, do not give the power of people, shut down the working place, do not give power to people, you take away the power of people. So rights, not rescues, as Soram said, is like people should get the full status of immigration so that they do not have fear to report any violence, so that criminal law against sex workers should be taken away. So we call it like the full decriminalization of sex work. So not only sex work should not be charged by criminal law, and also the client and also the third party should not be like criminalized, so that then the migrant sex worker can enjoy the rights, that they can protect themselves instead of need someone to rescue them. They can protect themselves when they have like more entitled, getting more access of their rights and resources. So that is what we need. And so that we have a lot of propagation and we have the petition. So please support and yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. And finally, we have a question for Saad. So based on some of your recent work, can you speak a little bit on how the racialization of migration in Canada and the implementation of neoliberal policies in the new public governance management has impacted the ability of the nonprofit sector to advocate on behalf of immigrants, and what can be done to combat these policies and enhance advocacy?
Thank you, Leila. So my recent work looked at the intersection of two disciplines, the public policy and immigration. So before giving you the answer to the question, I would like to give like a historical background of the Canadian public policy and link all these notions together. So the Canadian public policy has started in the late 19th century and it continued in its form until the mid-90s. And there has been a reform to that Canadian public administration management under the name of New Public Management, which happened in the mid-90s. And it brought several changes to the system of the public policy. Then we are talking about an emerging like reform, which is called New Public Governance. And this new public governance responds to the criticisms of the new public management that was in place in the mid-90s. And under this scope, public authorities negotiate and collaborate with public and private actors in the goal of offering compelling and democratic governance. It also allows shared learning among different actors. So they bring actors together in order to tackle policy issues. So now if we want to tie this to our topic and talking about non-governmental organizations, they are often referred to as the third sector. And in my opinion, they are crucial to bridge the gap between existing integration policies and the lived experiences of racialized populations. So until the mid-90s, settlement service providers benefited from the strong support of the federal government financially and also institutionally. They had capacity to meet immigrants' needs in the short and long terms. They were involved in policy advocacy and regulation. And under the new public management and neoliberalism, public authorities restricted the role of non-for-profit sector to essential service delivery. So therefore, the genuine partnerships turned into contracted short-term and competitive relationships with strict monitoring on each dollar spent. In other words, the government was giving financial support to those settlement agencies to help immigrants for their settlements, but also to integrate in the Canadian society. So they had it right at the beginning, but under the new public management, there were restrictions, there were funding cuts, and capacity restriction of these agencies to only like essential services such as like job search, language courses, or like some healthcare referrals and so on. Now, if we talk about the new public governance and it's a new way of management, it will allow actors of non-governmental agencies to be active in the policy process. They will be able to identify issues on the policy agenda stage of the policy making process. They will be able to participate in policy development through research and analysis, and also advance policy solutions, which is really needed for immigrants. So in another way, they will be able to participate in the policy making process and select what are the issues that are important. So they will be able to give voice to immigrants and try to determine the problems that they face at their arrival in Canada, and also try to change some existing policies. And I believe that this is very important. This is like an aspect that can bring a change. And we know that non-governmental agencies or organizations such as settlement service providers are well placed to engage in public policy advocacy and also to address recurrent problems that immigrants encounter like on daily basis when they come to Canada. So this is a new way to advocate for immigrants' rights and be able to give them a voice and try to improve some of the existing policies. So that's the answer to the question.
Thank you so much, Saad. So our panelist Simran has to head out now. So an immense thank you to Simran. We really appreciated you taking the time to speak on these issues, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet you.
All right. And for the final portion of our kind of scheduled Q&A, we have another general question, and then I'm going to open up to both Saad and Elaine. And then after that, we will move into audience questions. So please submit any questions you have before the end of this question so we can start compiling them. I'll start with Elaine. Can you talk a little bit about the history of migrant justice and work? This is a pretty broad question, so feel free to kind of relate it back to your personal experience and speak a little bit on, what has progressed, what hasn't, what has triggered past progressive movements and what was their impact, and what current solutions are currently being conceptualized and realized by migrants. So that's a pretty long question, but hopefully you can speak a little bit on that.
Yeah, I do not do a lot of work to trace the whole history of migrant movement, but I think what we see is like when we see the challenge faced by everyone, particularly migrant, we also need to know how powerful is migrants' resist and fights back every day, right? So no matter how much challenge they face, they are using different way and their own resources to resist, including like support by living together, or like take care of each other, so or use different tactic to handle all the situation they do. But that is challenging if the people just do it in the individual level. So that's why we really see building the collective power is so important. But it's also so challenging, as you like the question you mentioned before, they are being excluded in so many area. So when they need to come together, is so difficult and challenged. By coming together, they can have like more support, the community support of each other, but also by coming together, they can build the power to bring the change, right? So no matter in the formal system or informally. So and I think that's why we really need to see why. So for example, the Migrant Rights Network in now in Canada, and also the MWAC, Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, what they have been doing is supporting individual group of different migrant group to build a capacity, but also bring different migrant group together to bring the collective power, and also develop the migrants' rights movement. But when we talk about migrants' rights movement, we do not need to forget like about the class, about the immigration status, and about the race, right? So but by building together now, for example, they are bringing the status for all campaign, and also challenging the discourse, because I think there is so many harmful migrant discourse, particularly who are deserving migrant, right? That who are the migrant, they can really contribute to the society by that they actually privilege like the more people from European country, the white people, and also more like people with more resources or education background, like without seeing and value all like the rights of the migrants. So, and I think that is so important that we support the migrants' rights movement, at the same time also support like the racial justice, and also classism, and also like those things together, and also help to change the discourse related to migrant, to have chance to really have better understanding of the migrant story. That because as I said before, most of the migrant story also do not able to be heard in mainstream media. So that's why thank you for this panel, to give the opportunity to bring different perspective, and you are very important, and all the participants, you are important to help to share the voice, and also sign the petition, and also share the and join the campaign. And no matter what capacity you are also participate. So and because the policy and law is powerful way to take away power of the migrants. So that's why the changing the legal system, like and then make the people can access the right. That is like the most important, that the people can have better livelihood. And the other thing also, how to understand, as the very first question you asked, why people migrate, right? We also need to understand the complexity of the injustice of whole global world, and also acknowledge how the people should have the right to chase the dream, right? Migrant is not only seeing that people are being forced, but also like seeing that people are chasing the dream, and as adventurers to like try to explore different experience, and that is also very valuable thing in the process of migration. So that hope all of you continue support the work of migrant justice, and also particularly the support the work of Butterflies, so and also other sex worker organization, because our voice is small, but having you guys to support together can make the change. So for example, I have mentioned the city of Toronto is not allowed the worker to lock the door, but because we gained 500 petitions, particularly from not only the worker, but also from the community, they are willing to not enforce that law. So, and we are facing a lot of over-policing from the law enforcement by law officer in Toronto, but because there is a lot of legal clinic and also violence against women organization, and also a lot of like student to help advocate, that we can see a little bit change, but like we still need continuous the support, and you can make the change. Like, don't underestimate your power, and thank you for the organizer. You have the idea of this social justice, but you take the action, right, to create a platform and make us have chance to create the collective power, and I think that is very valuable. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Elaine. And I'll pass it on to Saad to respond to that question now.
Yeah, sure. So I will tie it to my professional experience. So while being part of various research projects, academic and professional research on immigration, I concluded that the existing knowledge around immigrants' experiences and the issues they face in Canada is not echoed outside of academia. In other words, the work that is done by academic researchers has like an indirect influence of on like the policy making process. The impact on the policy making process is not huge. So therefore, what I want to do in my dissertation, I want to foster partnerships and coalitions between academic institutions, non-governmental organizations, and immigrant populations themselves, to give them voice and to give the voice to the ones that are seeking active participation in the Canadian society and to influence decision-making process. So such coalitions will be able to report self-based evidence of challenges and services outcomes, and also policy problems around issues like settlement and integration. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you, Saad. So that concludes kind of the pre-prepared questions that we had. So we will move into a couple of audience questions that we received now. To start, there are many cases of Canadian immigrants unable to find jobs in their field of study because many institutions do not acknowledge their foreign degree is valid. What would be the first steps to go about resolving this issue? And I'll let either one of you respond to this. Kind of feel free to just jump in.
Yes, I can answer that question. So based on the research on the labor market, there is something very important that is kind of determining I would say, determining the way in which immigrants might integrate the Canadian labor market. There are some professions that are regulated by some governmental bodies, and there are some professions that are non-regulated. And even for the professions that are non-regulated, immigrants, when they come to Canada, they are having their credentials like non-recognized, and also their foreign work experience non-recognized. And why this is happening? Because like the governments, whether they're provincial or federal, they are giving this assessment to third parties. And these third parties, they are operating worldwide, and they have some criteria and that they use to assess the credentials. They compare them with the Canadian ones, and therefore they judge that whatever credential will not be fit with the Canadian education standards or the Canadian experience standards, and therefore they will not recognize this. So this is the problem. Those third parties, they don't necessarily have a knowledge about education in many other countries in the world. Education is universal, and therefore if we are talking about disciplines like physics, maths, economy, or other disciplines that are worldwide, the content of the studies is the same, and therefore they should take into consideration all the credentials, because there are many people that are brilliant in their countries, and they are attracted by the Canadian dream and the Canadian immigration experience. And when they come to Canada, they are kind of shocked because they believe that they were selected because they are the best. They are selected because of their education, because of their work experience. And there is a discrepancy between the selection criteria in the immigration scheme and the labor market outcome. Because on the one hand, we are selecting the best people and we are telling them we recognize your experience and diplomas to come to Canada. But once they arrive to Canada, this doesn't mean anything anymore. And then we are denying their experiences. So they don't understand. They say, well, we haven't been told this from the beginning. So why we were selected to start with, and then when we come and want to work, our credentials are not recognized. So there is this discrepancy, and like there are many initiatives to resolve this discrepancy, but it still exists. And if we have those third parties that are still making the evaluation, then I think nothing will change. So that's the answer to that question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to add is like how those credential requirement in Canada is intentionally exclude the migrant from like get assessing the power and exclude them to work in those instances. So one of the example is like Chinese medicine is the knowledge from many like Chinese culture background, and also many of Chinese they don't have those knowledge, but how they make the system that Chinese people do practice of Chinese medication, they need to know the English, right? That then by that they create a barrier and excludes those people really have the expertise and experience and skills from getting that like credential and being practiced here. So that like who can be the Chinese doctor? Now we see like more like English speaking people know about like and practicing. So the other example is like registered massage therapist. So massage is like also is come from a lot of wisdom from Asian community, and so that the people have been practicing very, very long. But then in the professionalization process and they create the credential, people need to have the credential, like who can assess, who can get the become the registered massage therapy is those people. They are privileged. They can pay like $20,000 or $30,000 school fee. The people can speak English, then they can become the RMT. So, but actually many people is able to do the practice and able to do the work, but is the social is the policymaker like to make them not able to do the job and make their knowledge is not being recognized. And I talk about it's not only the formal education like degree, but it's like the whole knowledge like migrant have is often being excluded in those process. Then they can keep them in the very low paid job, very bad working environment. Those job is not like Soram said, it's not like those white people, middle class people want to do. So.
Yeah, those are great insights. So our next question is not super closely related to migrant justice, but given both of your guys' backgrounds, we wanted to ask both the panelists what your experiences with discrimination and racism in academia towards people of color have been, and what are some ways we can go about remediating this? So feel free for either of you to jump in.
Yeah, I think like my first year in my PhD at McMaster University is very good example. So when I was in the university, I was being asked, so why there is so many Asian when they will go back home, right? So that is something is so shocked when I hear about that. But it's also, this is the work in many people heart and mind, right? So that by seeing that they already see us as others, by my beautiful accent, by how I look, right? That is like, and you can see also how racialized people and migrants may not have the same opportunity as like the Canadian-born, particularly white student, English as the first language, that you are being perceived as not capable, and many of your knowledge is not being recognized as academic, and also not being recognized in the academic world. I think that is something, and I think the notion of knowledge, right? What is knowledge is really built on the people, defined by the people with power, and also defined by like the colonialism idea, and also like the white supremacy. So, and I think this is so important to challenge those notion of like knowledge, what is knowledge, what is not knowledge, and in academic world, how to define knowledge is so important. So for example, you write a paper, you need to have APA format, you need to continue to cite all the rubbish thing you don't believe, but then by showing that you show you have the knowledge. But when you write your own idea, it's often not being recognized. You need to play the game as they define, and then at the end you waste so much time and energy, keep citing the people already have power, have position, and I think that would be great if we can continue to create the alternative way of the knowledge production, continues to create other sites we can continue to recognize and create our knowledge. So maybe one day you can be the professor or TA, so that how you can create more space for your student, particularly like migrant racialized student, that to use their creativity to challenge the formal knowledge or formal way of learning, that you may see there is like more interesting thing or beautiful thing, and that's what we need. And then I believe that we can like create those places and make the change. Yeah.
Thank you, Elaine. Saad, do you have any comments on that question?
Yes, I would like to share like a kind of situation that happened like in an academic level, and this situation will highlight the kind of hidden discrimination, and this is something like very important to highlight. Sometimes discrimination can be hidden, and I will give the example. So I was doing my master's in immigration and settlement studies at Ryerson in 2017, and we were about to finish the year, and we were required to like secure a placement. So at that time, the government of Canada was in contact with our master's program, and they were offering some like internship positions, but these internship positions were kind of like job postings. So you would have to, they come as job postings, and then you will have to apply as if you are applying to a job, even though it's an internship, right? So one thing that was really important to note is under the those job postings, they were saying preference will be given to Canadian citizens. And that's it. It like ended there. At that time, I was permanent resident, and I also thought about the international students that were with us in the classroom. And then I was saying, we are in a platform in which we are like decolonializing some aspects or concepts. We are deconstructing racism itself, and yet there is a situation in which racism is perpetuated even in like an academic level, and in relation to students that are willing to do placement. So in other words, they didn't say if you are permanent resident or international students, you are not allowed to apply. You could still apply, but the hidden aspect of racism is they are saying clearly the preference is given to Canadian citizens. And that at that time, I raised the issues in the program, and I was discussing, and the director of the program reached out to government of Canada And then they just replied, unfortunately, those are the criteria that we have, and it's not against someone else. We use them everywhere we go. But I found that it was like one aspect of hidden racism that can touch students. And like some people after that were able to secure jobs right after these internships. So I was thinking, how about international students that are in the need to secure jobs to stay in Canada? I didn't think about myself because I was permanent resident, so that's not the issue. But international students, that was an opportunity for them to work in Canada, but because of some restrictions, they were denied to be part of such placement. So that's something that I wanted to share.
Yes, thank you so much to both Elaine and Saad for sharing those personal experiences and reflections. So thank you all so much for this amazing discussion, and to the audience members for attending our webinar. I want to give a big thank you to Simran, Saad, and Elaine for joining us tonight and sharing their expertise. I personally really enjoyed listening to the discussion and learned a lot, and I hope audience members have as well. In case you missed something or want to re-watch the webinar, we'll post the link to this recording on the Facebook event page and to our social media channels. We'll also compile all of the resources that we mentioned in the chat during the discussion into a separate document that will also be shared on social media platforms and on the Facebook event page. So to make sure that you see the video and resource document once they're up, please follow our social media for both UTEA and VUSAC Sustainability Commission, which Andy and Sophia will plug one last time in the chat. And one last time, because we're always looking for more friends, if you're a U of T student and you're interested in doing direct climate action work, please don't hesitate to reach out to either group. We'll be hosting more events like this throughout the school year, probably not this semester, but next semester. And we're welcome to anyone in helping us out with planning these sorts of events and doing advocacy work on campus. So once again, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, and I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their evening. Thank you so much, and good night.
Thanks for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It was a
thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.